Good afternoon to everyone. Welcome to this special event. My name is Scott Appleby. I'm the Dean of the Keough School of Global Affairs. The Mirza Family Professorship in Islamic Thought and Muslim Societies was established through a gift by the family of the late Muzaffar Muzi Mirza. Mr. Mirza was a native of Rawalpindi in Islamabad, Pakistan. In 1976, he moved to the United States and earned degrees from Claremont McKenna College and the American Graduate School of International Management before embarking on a very successful career in banking, private equity management, and civic service. Muzi was married for 18 years to Sue Scribner, Notre Dame class of '79, who has kept his memory alive with and for their children, Alexander, Christina, and Sean. Sue has extended her late husband's legacy of generosity through her commitments to communities far and wide, serving, for example, as a member of the benefactors group 100 Strong at Save the Children, on the board of Notre Dame's Kroc Institute for International Peace Studies, and more recently on the Keough School's Advisory Council. A significant and enduring way to honor Muzi's life and their interreligious marriage, Sue determined, is to guarantee that Notre Dame students, and indeed American and other global citizens more generally, will always be able to appreciate Islam beyond the headlines and from the perspective of its leading scholars. Islam and Catholicism are the world's truly global missionizing religions and the crucible of world historical civilizations. The nations will not be at peace without the friendship of these great faiths. Thus, Sue is honoring this dual religious and cultural heritage through the gift of education for generations to come via the Mirza Family Professorship of Islamic Thought and Muslim Societies. Given the historic nature of this gift, Notre Dame's first endowed professorship in Islamic studies held by a Muslim scholar, the selection of the inaugural holder of the chair was of enormous importance. We needed to identify a figure of international renown whose publications, teaching, mentoring, intellectual leadership, and public presences placed that scholar in the top rank of the world's authorities on Islam. While this was not exactly like finding a needle in a haystack, it was a daunting assignment. Mixing metaphors, such people do not grow on trees. Well, to make a very long story short, we were remarkably successful in identifying and appointing the inaugural Mirza Family Professor. Ebrahim Moosa is, to begin, a truly global figure. His family history, course of studies, and professional assignments have taken him from his native Cape Town, South Africa, to Kanpur and Lucknow, India, to London and Paderborn, Germany, to Durham, North Carolina, Palo Alto, California, to Kathmandu and Dhaka, and most exotic of all, to South Bend, Indiana. Indeed, Ebrahim has taught, mentored, and formed students at Duke, Stanford, Notre Dame, the University of Cape Town, and is apprenticing students from India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, and beyond. He is a traveling star, a peripatetic pilgrim, a world wanderer. I've mentioned some of Ebrahim's merely physical presences, which is very limiting for a 21st century globalist who has had a commanding virtual presence in online forums around the world and a highly influential voice on all varieties of national, global, and social media. In his role as a public intellectual, translator of Islam to a nervous world, especially after 9/11, but also in his earlier life as an opponent of apartheid in South Africa, Ebrahim has been a supremely effective advocate and educator and a courageous voice for justice, in some cases at the risk of his own life. A disciplinary polymath who thinks and writes as a historian, theologian, religio-legal ethicist, moral philosopher, and critical theorist, Moosa is in constant demand. Named as one of the world's most influential Muslims by the Royal Islamic Strategic Studies Center, he is regularly invited to join or lead research projects on topics such as making peace with the jihadists, religious armed conflict, and prospects for conflict resolution, as he was invited to do by the Department of Peace and Conflict Research at Uppsala University, Sweden, or genomics and Islamic ethics, as he was invited to address by the Research Center for Islamic Legislation and Ethics, Hamad bin Khalifa University in Doha, Qatar. The John Templeton Foundation awarded him a multi-million-dollar grant on advancing theology and scientific literacy in Madrasa Discourses in India and Pakistan. The Madrasa Discourses project is a truly innovative, terrific project. If you're not aware of it, I'd encourage you to Google it, Madrasa Discourses. This is a project that that Ebrahim and initially Mahan Mirza and now Josh Lupo and others have worked on for some years now, that brings together former Madrasa students from India and Pakistan to contextualize, we might say, their education in the Madrasa with a full curriculum on history, Western thought, science, evolution, and it has been remarkably successful, not only in deepening the education of these leaders in South Asia, in this case, in the Islamic world, but also in building fellowships across two nations that have constantly been in a cold or hot war. So it's been a really innovative, terrific, daring project. And we at Keough and Notre Dame are just absolutely pleased with that, among many other things Ebrahim has pioneered. As you can easily see, Professor Moosa has achieved a great deal in his career thus far. Quite impressive. But all of these achievements taken together would not have qualified him for an honor as prestigious and significant as the Mirza Family Professorship in Islamic Thought in Muslim Societies. The recipient of an endowed chair at a major university like Notre Dame must have established a world-class reputation as a research scholar first and foremost, which is measured primarily by the quality and influence of the professor's scholarly publications. And in this all-important category, Ebrahim has also distinguished himself. He is the author of Ghazali and the Poetics of Imagination, the winner of the 2006 American Academy of Religions Award for the Best First Book Prize in the History of Religions. Ghazali also received the Choice Outstanding Academic Title Award for 2005, and Ziauddin Sardar, a columnist of the New Statesman, chose it as one of the two best books of 2005. One of the prominent reviewers of the book called it, quote, an erudite and imaginative rereading of al-Ghazali's vast intellectual and spiritual legacy with a view to demonstrating its lasting relevance to intellectual debates in the contemporary Muslim community. Moosa, he continues, is absolutely right in emphasizing al-Ghazali's towering stature in and long-ranging influence on Sunni Islam. For some, he is nothing short of a cult figure. Here, I think the reviewer means Ghazali, not Ebrahim, but it's ambiguous. He is something of a cult figure until recently in the Shafi'i areas of Yemen. Copying Ghazali's masterpiece was considered not just an act of piety, but a direct path to paradise. The reviewer continues, I had to read this line, Moosa would probably not appreciate this belief, which goes against the grain of his project to bring out the creative potential of al-Ghazali's insights into the meaning of faith, religion, ethics, and soteriology. More recently, Ebrahim published What is a Madrasa? One reviewer summarized his contributions to knowledge as follows: alternating between personal memoir, history, and a qualitative study of India and Pakistani madrasas, Ebrahim Moosa's What is a Madrasa endeavors to address this politically fraught question, while also proposing ways to ensure the madrasa's future relevance in an ever-changing geopolitical and religious landscape, written for a general public, students and teachers, as well as for the policymakers and his former madrasa teachers whom he addresses directly. The book weaves together the histories, practices, and roles of madrasa education in India and Pakistan, from preserving and circulating particular forms of knowledge to shaping religious subjectivities and impacting political sentiments, madrasas are an integral part of how Islam is understood, enacted, and transmitted. Moosa examines their multiple functions and their heterogeneous iterations, balancing his appreciation for their particular contributions to the sustenance of Islamic scholarship and subjectivities with a critical stance on the increasingly narrow purview that have constricted the madrasa system in recent years. I could go into detail about the many other edited volumes, translations, and other publications and articles of Professor Moosa. But I'll note only at this point that he is working on two newer projects still. Their titles are After Revelation, Debating Muslim Ethics, and the Implications of Dignity in Islam. Please join me in welcoming our Mirza family professor, Ebrahim Moosa.
Thank you, Professor Appleby. Thank you, Dean Appleby. Thank you, Scott. Thank you and good afternoon, all of you, for joining us here today. I want to particularly thank the Mirza family, Sue Scribner Mirza, extended family here, for making this event not only possible, but endowing it for a long, long time. I also want to thank all the people here gathered here today in person, some of my students, some of my colleagues, but also I'm told there are a number of people online. And I'm particularly to thank my family members who are here today. I'm really, really, really touched that they could come here today. I don't know why I do this. I shouldn't talk about my family because it's quite emotional. But I also want to welcome and thank all the directors of the institutes in the Keough School and for the collegiality of all of you who have come here today. So I need to do a couple of things and I have to keep this in my hand. So here we go. Debating progress and history in Islamic thought, progress and its discontents. In 1897, a famine affected the Bombay Presidency in India. Also known as the Bombay Province, this administrative territory of British India included some regions south and north of what is today the city of Mumbai, once known as Bombay. To the north is the affluent state of Gujarat, once part of the Bombay Presidency. A drought preceded the 1897 famine, which continued into 1899. For those of you familiar with India, you should know that Gujarat is famously known as the birthplace of Mahatma Gandhi. And less famously, Gujarat is also the state where India's current and 14th Prime Minister, Narendra Modi, ruled as Chief Minister for 12.5 years. Despite Modi's reputation being tainted in 2002 for human rights violations against Muslims that were amply documented and globally condemned, he rose to power in 2014 on a Hindu nationalist wave. Modi has been the most polarizing figure in modern Indian history for advancing an ultra-right-wing Hindu nationalist agenda. But back to history. Famines in India, the Nobel Prize-winning economist Amartya Sen found, were not due to a lack of food. Instead, inequalities in the distribution of food were the main cause of famines. My ancestors, too, were refugees affected by a combination of colonial mismanagement and ecological catastrophe, long before these terms were invented. In 1898, at the height of the famine, the fourth son of Isa Valli, named Moosa, was born. His village was known as Vahalu. And you can see that this famine was also recorded in the Chicago Tribune, which my colleague Josh Lupo researched for me. His village was known as Vahalu and was located about 12 miles or 12.8 kilometers, 8 miles away from the city of Bharuch today. Today, Bharuch is an overcrowded city on the banks of the great Narmada River. From humble origins as subsistence farmers, my great-grandfather's family was badly affected by the drought since it drastically impacted their livelihood. Some started to look at possibilities outside India, this time made possible by the ability to travel and work in other British colonial holdings. At the turn of the 20th century, Moosa and his two brothers, Bagas and Adam, followed in the path of several Gujaratis who made their way to Southern Africa. And I just discovered that Mirza's mother is of Gujarati stock. When they reached the port city, that is my great-grandfather reached the port city of Durban on the Indian Ocean coast, they found the place overtraded and thus made their way down further south to Cape Town, reaching there around 1902. If we allow for some errors in documentation, one can with some confidence say that Moosa Isa, that is Moosa, the son of Isa, and in South Africa, he went as Moosa Isa, as he was known, was somewhere between 12 and 16 when he arrived in Africa with his two brothers. Life in the Cape was tough. There were few people of Gujarati descent, and the place was alienating. His elder two brothers found the rigors of the Cape unbearable and hastily returned to India. They did leave a legacy and some words that will not be repeated in polite company. Not knowing how to read and write in English, Moosa Isa often used his thumb imprint as his signature on official documents. Our family took his first name as our family name, Moosa. He persevered as a fruit seller, carrying his produce on his shoulders and hawking it to customers in the city of Cape Town. He took up residence, and this is a clip we recently found where his history is documented in the South African Indian Who's Who. Our family, he took up residence in the area known as District 6, which the planners of apartheid had to finally destroy in the 1970s, since it defied the policy of racial segregation for people of different ethnic and religious cultures. And that's what you see, this house where this Volkswagen is, in that house I was born, and right on the opposite side is the mosque that my great-grandfather had a big hand in building. Later, my great-grandfather opened a store on the famous Grand Parade, and by the time he died, he was known as a fierce businessman specializing in the banana wholesale trade, popularly known, and he was known as Moosa Cape Town. As a subsistence farmer, he knew the value of land. He invested most of his wealth in property, both in South Africa and in India. By the time he died, he accumulated a substantial amount of farming land in Vahalu and not an insignificant amount of property in Cape Town. From famine-ravaged poverty to modest wealth, Moosa Isa never forgot his origins nor his duty to society. He was instrumental in the building of a mosque in the District 6 neighborhood, the mosque that I showed you, and also did many things in his village. He never forgot his origins in his village in India and did not abandon his faith and culture in a very westernizing environment of colonial South Africa under British and later Afrikaner rule. One could say my great-grandfather was obsessed with his primary duty to support his village and community in India and South Africa. No, he loved and reveled in service. This devotion to service stemmed from his faith. He personally supervised every major construction he undertook. He embodied the truth in the sense that, as Vikram Chandra puts it in his breathtaking novel, Sacred Games, love was duty and duty was love. Using his own wealth, but also contributions from others, he was the pioneering spirit who oversaw the building of a mosque in Vahalu, as well as a grand elementary madrasa, the equivalent of a Sunday school for the daily religious instruction of young girls and boys. He also constructed a water tower for the storage of well water and built stairs leading into the village pond, the talab, and this is the image of the madrasa that Moosa Isa built, and also a village pond, stairs leading to the village pond for the safety of women who use the pond for sundry purposes, including the washing of clothes and utensils. This was long before the village had running water installed in homes. In addition, he built a grand 3-level house for himself, hoping that his offspring one day would return and enjoy the respite offered by village life and its pastoral environment. No one did return except myself, who visited the village during my student year, and I visited the village during my student years in India and frequently, or not frequently, but from time to time, pay a visit. A secular primary school that was incomplete at the time of his death on 15th of May, 1965, but was completed after his death. In 2005, the entire school building was rebuilt, but the doors of the old school, handpicked and paid for by my great-grandfather, were preserved and retrofitted into the new school in preservation of his memory. My great-grandfather was a man of strong character. He was resilient and kind, but he also had a fierce determination to get his way. A lover of fine horses for his carriage, part of his daily routine in India was to stop, get off his carriage at the shrine of an unnamed saint in the village square, offer a prayer, and then go on to the city of Bharuch to conduct his business. And the person on the right, that was my late father and his brother. And this is me, my late sister and her mother. My mother was born in India. So the movie's over. Today, I'm honored to be the inaugural holder of the endowed Mirza Family Chair in Islamic Thought and Muslim Societies in the Keough School of Global Affairs, and with an appointment in the Department of History. One of the key themes of the Keough School is integral human development, an idea drawn from Catholic social teachings. But in different iterations, this value, the set of values, is espoused by many faith traditions, including Judaism and Islam, Hinduism, Buddhism, and also secular ideologies like Marxism and socialism. When I study my grandfather's legacy, I can honestly say that integral human development was baked into his DNA. His philanthropy and altruism centered around service to humanity. His means to these ends were the mosque, faith, and his practical knowledge of the Islamic tradition, and his sense of the importance of education, because he was not formally educated. Even though he was not literate in faith matters, in other words, he could not read the Quran, nor did he read books about religion. I guess he wanted me to do that. Yet he embodied the tenets of religion in a unique way. He integrated faith and society. And my wish is for some of these tenets that my great-grandfather inculcated to continue to run in our practice. With today's celebration of the Mirza Chair, the irony will not be lost on you that two diasporic legacies come to fruition at the University of Notre Dame, the premier Catholic university in the United States. My family's history goes back to a colonial pre-partition Indian story, then to colonial, apartheid, and post-apartheid South Africa, and now the United States. Muzaffar Mirza, the late husband of Susan Scribner Mirza, who endowed this chair in memory of him, came from Pakistan to study in the US, and then later made this country his home with Sue. I'm relating the story of my ancestors in some parallels to the history of the late Mr. Mirza for several reasons. One is to locate myself in my family's history, a journey that now connects me to 3 continents. The other reason is to raise the question which is central to this lecture, the theme of history and progress. In this room and online, many of you also have the experience of coming from distant lands and locales to this country. We can all relate to migration stories. Each migration story makes history in one way or another. Does it also represent progress in different ways? That's a difficult question. What iterations of progress are we talking of? And what are its vocabularies and imaginaries? How does one imagine both progress and history? And what are their outcomes for human flourishing? How can we go beyond a common sense to grasp these issues? The question of progress. The idea of progress has been inspired by certain biblical themes of an apocalyptic end along with a mechanistic view of the world with an aim to create a new Jerusalem. Excuse me. The idea of progress represents a secularized version of the Christian belief in providence, wrote Christopher Lasch in his 1991 classic, The True and Only Heaven. In numerous apocalyptic writings, according to Ernest Tuvison, history was endowed with a plot and encompassed a narrative of what happened before and what was expected to come. Building on the Hebraic tradition, Christian thinkers and pioneers adopted the moral narratives of the Bible to their own special interpretation of the divine. St. Augustine found compelling the idea that history was ultimately progressive, leading to an eschatological end. Later, Protestant attitudes implicitly held that history moves by divinely preordained and revealed stages to the solution of human dilemmas. So I'm safe at the Catholic University, so we can beat up on the Protestants. After centuries, I'm only kidding. After centuries of experience, we also realize that progress is Janus-faced. It has opposing sides to it. In its strongest posture, progress signifies a particular relation to history. That history has an end, a telos, and a predetermined goal. In a more benign way, progress could mean advances in knowledge, improvements in the human condition, and the acquisition of some abilities and the loss of others. In his theses on the philosophy of history, Walter Benjamin, the Jewish German scholar, thinker, meditates on the painting of the Swiss painter Paul Klee, who died in 1940, called Angelus Novus. This image of the angel is for Benjamin the beguiling image of the angel of history. Now, this whole image requires a lot of interpretation, but just believe me that this angel is looking backward and the wind is taking him forward. Or that's how we are supposed to believe this interpretation. Here, Benjamin's caution and deep ambivalence towards historicism surfaces strongly. Historicism is the theory that social and cultural phenomena are determined by history, or that history is the most basic aspect of human existence. In Benjamin's view, adherents of historicism would tend to empathize with the victors in history. They might forget that there are other claimants to history, a lesson Francis Fukuyama ignored in his book, The End of History and the Last Man. What intrigues Benjamin in the Klee painting, I say Benjamin and Benjamin because in South Africa it goes as Benjamin, but I've since been educated, it's Benjamin. What intrigues Benjamin in the Klee painting is how the angel flies. His wings are spread, but his face is turned towards the past. The wings of the angel cannot close because they are kept open by a violent storm from paradise that propels him into the future. With a strong dose of irony, Benjamin comments, the storm is what we call progress. We now literally recognize the storm as the environmental degradation and the impending climate catastrophe that awaits us and future generations, as every reliable indicator informs us. Even before Benjamin, earlier romantic thinkers like Herder, Jacobi, Hamann, and T.S. Eliot refused to accept the inevitability of progress. What kind of trajectory of time and change does the Muslim tradition offer? The period immediately prior to Islam, known as the Jahili period, was renowned for his poetry, and the Arabs took pride in their poetry as their choicest repository of wisdom. It was a repository in this sense, writes Tarif Khalidi, that it supplied much of the wisdom and the practical moral standards handed down from one generation to the next. The proverbial wisdom involved a heroic conception of life, where the unforeseen change from prosperity to wretchedness, the fleeting character of life and friendships, the exhilaration of love and wine, pride in lordly generosity, or even-handed revenge featured in human life. With the advent of Islam, some of this wisdom was translated into Islamic categories. The wine definitely went out by the door. The Islamic vision of history acknowledged a sense of space and time. Space and time were ideally inhabited by those who acknowledge God's lordship and majestic power in creating the world for the use of humans. Human responsibility involved being a witness of God on earth and undertaking this task of stewardship. Time, however, is less of a chronology of events in the Quran and more of a continuum in which past, present, and future are collapsed. Adam, Abraham, Moses, and Muhammad are at once present as the eternal present in the Quran, and all of history is present to God in terms of divine omniscience. Humans are invited to see the parables in the scriptures and in the handiwork of God in nature. Truth is captured in knowledge, and humans are obliged to seek knowledge, meaning they are to seek truth from the cradle to the grave. By the 15th century, the writing of history in Islamic age societies had already transitioned to new conceptions of history. The earliest phase was a transition from prophetic wisdom to history, then from providential to communal history, and then from the overwhelming and monumental Quranic time, writes Khalidi, to the sequential listing, dating, and recording of individual actions performed by members of a community that was beginning to realize the merit of its progress in time and the coming into being of a time scheme which strove to historicize early Islam and to use it to establish hierarchies of moral or social seniority or prestige. History, in my view, can best be described as a series of responses to contingencies and explanations of the conditions in the world. Sometimes these contingencies are expressed in distinctive genres and topics. In some eras, history is preoccupied with the exploits of prophets and kings. At other times, it meticulously documents the lives of influential scholars and pious figures as servants of knowledge and learning, namely those who care about the truth. History also seeks to understand what moral lesson every epoch provides. Let me share with you two brief illustrations that exemplify how history is conceived in modern Muslim experiences. There may be more, but for now, two will suffice because I don't want to keep you here for too long after 5. One is by Muhammad Assad, and the other is by Fazlur Rahman, both leading 20th century thinkers. Muhammad Assad, born Leopold Weiss, was an early influence on my thinking, and his life and writings continue to fascinate me. He is the father of the renowned anthropologist, Professor Talal Assad, and I'm told that Professor Assad has honored me by tuning in via Zoom today. In his book, The Road to Mecca, Muhammad Assad documents his fascinating travels for 6 years on camelback in Arabia after his conversion to Islam in 1926. He talks movingly about his very close friend Zayd, with whom he traveled the length and breadth of Arabia. Muhammad Assad also had a close relationship with King Ibn Saud. Zayd, however, was a member of the Al-Rashid, a rival kinship or clan to the Al-Saud. In the early years of the 20th century, the Al-Rashid lost out to the Al-Saud in control of the Arabian Peninsula. We reach a point in the book where Assad and Zayd reach the city of Ha'il, which is the capital of the Al-Rashid, and Zayd belongs to the Al-Rashid. And so it has been many years since Zayd has been to Ha'il, and Assad asked him, and there you have the quote. Maybe I could read it out. Normally you don't read out a quote, but this is such a nice quote to read out. How does it feel, Zayd, to be back in the town of thy youth after all these years? Assad asked his companion. I'm not sure, my uncle, he replied slowly. That's a respectful term. 11 years since I was here last. Thou knowest my heart would not allow me to come here earlier. Zayd then cites a passage from the Quran about God being the sovereign who gives and takes sovereignty. Then Zayd adds, no doubt God gave sovereignty to the house of Ibn Rashid, but they, that is the people of Ibn Rashid, did not know how to use it rightly. They were reckless in their pride. So God took away their rule and handed it back to Ibn Saud. I think I should not grieve any longer. For is it not written in the book, sometimes you love a thing and it may be worse for you, and sometimes you hate a thing and it may be the best for you. Muhammad Assad's comment that follows this exchange is illuminating and is tinged with wisdom. There is a sweet resignation in Zaid's voice, he writes, a resignation implying no more than the acceptance of something that has already happened and cannot therefore be undone. It is this acquiescence of the Muslim spirit to the immutability of the past, the recognition that whatever has happened had to happen in this particular way and could have happened in no other. That is so often mistaken by Westerners for a fatalism inherent in an Islamic outlook. But the Muslims' acquiescence to fate relates to the past and not to the future. It is not a refusal to act. It is not a refusal to hope. It is not a refusal to improve, but a refusal to consider past reality as anything but an act of God. These are the thoughts, Muhammad Assad, of a man who lost a father and a sister in the genocide that engulfed Europe in the run-up to the Second World War. In this example, there is not only a sensibility of history from below, that is Zaid's experience, but also an experiential philosophy of life, of which history is only a reflection. Important to note is his insight as to how Muslims have dealt with the past as an immutable fact. In a sense of history that leaves the future open, for humans will not achieve except that for which they strive. This is according to a piece of Quranic wisdom. It is that striving that is critical to making history. If the past is rendered immutable, it does not preclude one to act, to hope, to improve, and as Assad put it, nor is it a future that is preordained as in the secularized version of progress. And in a century or more, we have learned that progress can come at a cost to humans and nature. Fazlur Rahman, the Pakistani emigre scholar to the United States and professor of Islamic thought at the University of Chicago, that I'm sure Dean Appleby has seen many more times than I have, and whose writings I have studied carefully, expressed his conception of history in the following words. Rahman writes, Islam is the first actual movement known to history that has taken society seriously and history meaningfully, because it perceived that the betterment of this world was not a hopeless task, not just pis aller, a last resort or expedient, but a task in which God and man are involved together. While history and society feature as crucial elements in Rahman's writings in the 1960s, his task at hand at the time was to depict the career of Islam as a civilizational force, as well as a faith tradition for individuals. The idea of history also served a greater purpose. Rahman's various studies led him to understand that history allowed one to reshape the normative questions in Islamic thought. For Rahman, the story of the advent of Islam, its scriptures, norms, and symbols, the actual forces of Arabian culture, were all constructively manipulated to become the material of history for the moral cause. And then he says, if history is the proper field for divine activity, historical forces must by definition be employed for the moral end as judiciously as possible. But Rahman is, of course, a Muslim modernist, and he proudly wore that label and was different from Assad. Muslim philosophy of history, or more accurately, philosophies have been described by others as, philosophies of history are somewhat compelled to discern the providential in history. Let me read that last sentence. Muslim philosophy of history, or more accurately, philosophies of history, are somewhat compelled to discern the providential element in history, and in the hands of earlier historians, past reality was dissected as an act of God after the fact. But modernist Muslim thinkers like Rahman purchased a larger dose of historicism, like his earlier counterparts in Egypt, notably Taha Hussein, to inscribe moral ends as a telos of history. In other words, the secular idea of progress did indeed impact certain trends of Muslim thinking. On the face of it, few can quibble with these moral ends. The question is, whose morals are the aim? And how do you know which morals are the right ones to hold? Should the moral ends necessarily be hitched to the wagon of history? Even when Rahman does rethink his position, he cannot extricate himself from the modern moral circle. Progress, he says, we all want, Rahman, as the philosopher theologian clarifies, not despite Islam, nor besides Islam, but because of Islam. For we all believe that Islam, as it was launched as a movement on earth in the 7th century Arabia, represented pure progress, moral and material. Rahman was possibly closer to R.G. Collingwood, the English historian, who thought that the end of history was self-knowledge. Here I have hopefully more than telegraphed two modern Muslim conceptions of history with their own overlaps and inner contestations. But this contestation between the Muslim romantic Assad and the modernist Rahman should not be surprising. For the one, history is open. For the other, history has a moral purpose. The story of history in the West has also shaped the story of history around the globe. Speaking in a couple of minutes, or a couple of, and I hope some of you don't leave to go there, is Dipesh Chakrabarti, who's speaking at Notre Dame just after 5. He's been spending his whole life in trying to understand history from the perspective of South Asia and from people outside the West. Reinhard Koselleck, the German historian, has done excellent work in trying to explain to us the very idea of history has changed in modernity. For Koselleck, the very idea of time in our conceptions of history has changed. Here, I think he has listed modernity's immanence, in other words, the preference for human indwelling in the here and now over transcendence, the idea that there is something deeper and further away from us and not so immanent. And so he has made the idea of immanence as a decisive marker to capture the spirit of modernity. Therefore, Koselleck can, with an admirable level-headedness, tell us, I was almost going to say, with an admirable German level-headedness, tell us, time is no longer simply the medium in which all history takes place. It gains a historical quality. Consequently, history no longer occurs in, but through time. Time becomes a dynamic and historical force in its own right. The insight is brilliant, possibly reflective of how existence is experienced in one part of the world. But does it have universal application? If I understand him, and the man is very deep and very complex, then he means to say that time is not independent from us, nor does it transcend us. In other words, in previous eras, we lived in time. Now, we and our experiences and our heightened self-awareness is collapsed into one category of immanent being, and thus we live through time. In other words, he's saying, we are time. We embody time. In other words, the individuated self, or that the element of individualism is coterminous with historicism, that is, history is everything, and has now taken center stage. I agree that each of us is a time clock, a biological and experiential time clock. However, when our clocks expire, it does not mean that the very idea of time expires. It is our experience of time as an individual that expires. Time will continue for our offspring and loved ones, albeit in a different way, for it will be without us. And one looks in vain in Koselleck for an understanding of self, where some humans do understand that on death, a different kind of temporality inserts itself, eternity or cyclical notions of birth and rebirth. So it is not unusual that the modern conception of history affected Muslim lives. During the first half of the 20th century, many Muslims emerging from the dark night of colonialism wanted to improve their futures. They also willingly adopted notions of Western and colonial history. In that era, to be a progressive Muslim was a badge of honor. I too have been described by others as being a progressive Muslim, even though I prefer the moniker of being a critical traditionalist. But the progressive badge sticks to anyone who advocates the need to revisit ethical and moral strictures that no longer comport with our experiences of the world. So one does notice that in most Muslim historical writings, there is a sense of improvement, making things better from what it was before. The accumulation of experiences, technologies, wealth, and resources do make things easier for those who have it. Hence, the rich have a duty to the poor. There had to be an interdependence of different classes to coexist and shape forms of life. While there was no idea of progress, there was a sense of advancing and making things easier. Instead of laboring like a beast, it was better to use a beast, tools and implements to make human life more comfortable. There was also a sense that when you use a beast as a means, the treatment should be humane and with integrity. My own research over time has shifted in dramatic ways. For the story of how I ended up in the madrasas of India for my formative education in Islamic thought, I will invite you to read my book, What is a Madrasa? Post-madrasa life for me had several stages. First in journalism in the UK and then South Africa. This was followed by community activism in the Muslim Youth Movement of South Africa as national director. My colleague and friend, Dr. Rashid Omar, was president of the same organization, where we combated apartheid on an Islamic platform. The next stage for me was graduate school, followed by academia, and I didn't want to leave it. My extensive studies of tradition, the social practices I engaged in, and the need to develop solutions for faith communities often led me to one question. How does a faith tradition, with its myriads of practices, beliefs, morals, and ethical ideals, countenance the questions of change over time? A faith tradition with 7th century Arabian imprints that develops and grows into multiple cultures and civilizations must cope with change. By now, you must have realized that the discursive tradition of Islamic thought was always a central thread of my practice and intellectual life, in addition to the multiple layers of my identity and professional preoccupations. In pursuit of this question of change, I studied the work of Abu Hamid al-Ghazali, a Persian scholar who enjoys an enviable stature in the Muslim tradition. And if any of you, many people are familiar with Augustine, and Aquinas in the Christian tradition, Ghazali flies in that same orbit. In my view, Ghazali's major contribution was twofold. One was to expand the knowledge framework with which he explained his faith tradition. The second was to allow for spiritual and mystical experiences to also have a place in the epistemic realm that is in the framework of knowledge. He robustly introduced philosophical and logical arguments in his many theological writings to frame his tradition in the elite idiom of his time, which consisted of philosophical and metaphysical arguments. He was so enamored by philosophy that fellow scholars, both during his time and after, chastised him for grafting Greek and Persianate ideas onto the tapestry of knowledge provided by the Arabian prophet. He frequently drew on the experiences of mystics to elaborate the inner meanings and subtleties of religious practices. So what for Ghazali might have appeared an improvement, development, even progress with a small p, was for others the very opposite. And let's remember, this contestation over Ghazali's legacy happens long before the advent of what we call the era of modernity. One such Shafi traditionalist of a Kurdish background, Ibn Salah, who dies in 1245, an expert in prophetic traditions, lamented Ghazali's claim that whoever did not master logical thinking was not qualified to delve into matters related to legal theory and jurisprudence, fiqh and usul al-fiqh, a critical discipline among the Muslim religious discourses. Ibn al-Jawzi, a Hanbali analyst, that means the person who collects history thinking in terms of years, completely lost it when Ghazali tried to justify some unusual Sufi practice. I won't go into the details right now, or maybe I should. Ghazali said that if you think that you're experiencing some pride in you, then go into a public bath and put on the clothes of the various people, and then walk out slowly so someone can trap you and beat the blazes out of you. And in that way, you will experience humility and your ego will be broken. And Ibn al-Jawzi says, how can you say something like this? He's complete, and he said Ghazali is now completely disqualified to do the work of Islamic law. Whereas in fact, Ghazali wrote some of the most monumental books on this topic. So guess who won? The guy who was doing some small progressive work. And he basically said that. And later in the 14th century, the famous Taqiyuddin Ibn Taymiyyah, who died in 1328, criticized Ghazali on several issues. The most significant one is this. Most philosophers and some theologians and mystics held a fairly standard view that prophecy was a divine gift. In other words, you can't go and work out and do a lot of work to get the gift of prophecy. Prophecy was not something you can work for. It is divinely bestowed. However, many Orthodox authorities nevertheless held that the essence of prophecy was the imagination. The essence of prophecy was the imagination. This idea they borrowed from Muslim philosophers. How? Well, imagination was related to the quality and luminescence of the soul. The gift of the imagination enabled the prophet and all other prophets and their followers to deal with the contingencies of life, guided by the creative imagination burnished by prophecy. Coupled with his view on prophecy, Ghazali also viewed the development of the soul through spiritual practices to be the culmination of religious life. And given his predilection for spirituality, this was a great fit, the question of imagination and spirituality. Here he welcomed and endorsed many of the practices adopted by the Muslim mystics, known as Sufism. Ibn Taymiyyah, by contrast, was clearly opposed to a concept of prophecy that gave an opening to the imagination and certain forms of Sufi imaginaries, especially if such spiritual practices had no scriptural mandate, because Ibn Taymiyyah feared corruption to Islamic doctrine and practice. So Ibn Taymiyyah was the guy who said, anything that is not endorsed by the Prophet of the Quran, you cannot introduce it. And he was obviously very much upset that the philosophers and Ghazali borrowed from the philosophers to create this kind of independent of scriptural imperatives and to do that kind of work. In his view, that is in Ibn Taymiyyah's view, revelation depended on a fideistic commitment, that is a commitment purely based on faith, as a demonstration of one's utter reliance on the teachings of God. This had to be accompanied by a belief that these teachings were transmitted to prophets via the agency of angels. Ghazali, of course, accepted the traditional doctrine of revelation, but he also made it more expansive to create a significant place for the imagination. So this was, in his view, the highlight of the event of prophecy. Ibn Taymiyyah consistently refuted Ghazali, and later he also targeted the Muslim mystic Ibn Arabi with stronger theological accusations. Ibn Taymiyyah was unable to come to terms with the idea of how revelation affectively works. Affectively meaning through your body and through your emotions and your feelings, works through the power of the soul without the theological guardrails that he insisted that the doctrine should have to keep you safe. In other words, he always thought that, human beings are kind of babies when it comes to faith. They must always have guardrails. In Ibn Taymiyyah's view, Ghazali swallowed too much philosophy, and this poisonous dose corrupted his thinking and made him divert from strict scripturalist renderings of the faith. But here's the irony: for all his fascination with philosophy, Ghazali too nevertheless found fault with the views of the philosophers. And this is Ghazali in a portrait by Khalil Gibran. Ghazali singled out Ibn Sina, Avicenna, whose philosophical claims, he argued, clash with three theological doctrines in Ghazali's counting. The philosopher, that is Ibn Sina, argued and denied bodily resurrection and claimed that resurrection on the day of judgment would be in the form of the soul, not the body. Also said that Avicenna believed that God only partook or only knew things that were universal, not particular, and that the world was eternal. That, Ghazali said, was contrary to standard Muslim doctrine, and therefore on these issues Ghazali took a harsh line and declared that such beliefs placed one outside the standard and accepted faith doctrines of Islam. In my own opinion, Ghazali could have found extenuating circumstances and explanations for the ideas of the philosopher, but he showed no leniency. But he did show a lot of leniency and made a lot of space for the Muslim mystics, who sometimes said really weird things. Later, Averroes, Ibn Rushd, or Averroes, in a heroic defense of the philosophers, did a point-by-point refutation and rebuttal of Ghazali's arguments. He showed that Ghazali himself contradicted some of his own canons of interpretation in his critique of the philosophers. Ghazali thought that he was engaged in improving the discursive tradition of Islamic theological thought through his forays into philosophy. and many welcome this as an advance on the old ways. In a certain sense, this improvement is progress on what preceded it. But as you also heard, his ideas did receive broad reception across the sectarian divide. In fact, Shia people, Sunnis and Shias, all like Ghazali, which is quite a feat, but he did not enjoy a uniform reception. It was not an improvement for everyone. For some purists, Ghazali's work was a distortion of the original purity. So already in the 11th century, we can see the contestation over improvement. It depends whose improvement and who's approving improvement. Now, fast forward into the modern period. In 20th century, a range of Muslim thinkers in both Arabic-speaking and non-Arabic speaking regions took stock of their fortunes with the collapse of the Ottoman Empire. Prior to that, there was a major shakeup and transitions in the old empires in Iran and India. One resource these intellectuals and Muslim thinkers turned to was a very big hold-all category called the heritage, Turath. The call to study the heritage as a problematique or problem set stemmed from the fact that these thinkers who made this call were a class of intellectuals who benefited from the West. But they were also seeking internal validation by looking at their own tradition. At first, they took a backward glance, like the Klee of Benjamin's picture, the angel of history looking backwards, to ascertain the causes of the civilizational eclipse. In the face of Europe's rise, modernity prized itself as a product of enlightenment, reason, and rationality. Thus, Muslim thinkers also assumed that their civilizational future ought to be based on reason and rationality. A preoccupation with the heritage signifies many things. Being in awe of their own history is one. Another is to treat the past as a diagnostic resource to ask after the fact, why did they, the Muslims, miss the boat of enlightenment when Islam and Muslims did have a civilization that valued reason and rationality? A number of North African thinkers, for instance, and scholars 20th century would say that the enlightenment should have happened on this side of the Mediterranean, or not that side. So the question then arises, did Islam not preserve and advance the wisdom of the Greeks and the Indians? How did they lose rationality despite the fact that the Quran constantly invokes and exhorts one to display one's thinking and reason faculties? These intellectuals and some religious leaders also posed the same question, and they quickly found their answer. Muslim civilization had, they said, progressively neglected reason and abandoned rationality for other alternatives. Rationalism declined because philosophy was evacuated from Muslim culture, claimed those who partook in a speedy diagnosis that was not substantiated by any sustained and serious historical analysis. But this is what you would read in the newspapers. Oftentimes, these investigations were animated by nationalisms of different sorts, including Arab nationalism, shadowboxing Iranian and Ottoman intellectual contributions to Islam. A number of recent studies have shown that these analyses of the heritage materials and potted histories are palpably wrong, but the myths continue. The myth continues because it has taken the form of a scapegoat. The explanation went like this: rationalism was replaced by superstition and an extreme reverence for charismatic spiritual authorities, irrespective of whether the latter were dead or alive. If these spiritual authorities were alive, they created the cult of saints, and as the dead, they exercised their power at the mausoleums and shrines on the minds of their unwitting followers with debilitating consequences, the allegation went. For both of these alleged causes of intellectual decline, the modern analysts found Ghazali to have been the cause of deterioration of Islamic fortunes. Ghazali's critique of the philosophers, they believe, gave a body blow to reason. And given his preoccupation and preference for spiritual experiences, he validated the importance of Sufism. In doing so, he opened the door to superstition. In one fell swoop, these analysts found their scapegoat, and many continued to swat at Ghazali like one beats a piñata at a birthday party. But you will not be too surprised to find this narrative that blames Ghazali for the decline of Islam that blames Ghazali. You will find it to continue in public television documentaries by Neil deGrasse Tyson, to the learned tomes of philosophers like Muhammad Abid al-Jabri and Hassan Hanafi. The history of the causes of change over time and the reasons why cultures decline and discourses change requires a much more complex analysis. To understand such complex analysis, come to Notre Dame. Sorry, no, that was not in the text. I'm just checking some of you just to see how you're doing with time. To understand such complex issues, historians have devised an entire subspecialty known as historiography. Historiography, as many of you know, is a discipline dedicated to the sources and the writing of history. To put it simply, there is an ongoing debate as to what knowledge status history confers on the documents and sources we possess. Contemporary theorists, I got so engrossed in my conversation, but I think this would be a good kind of refresher for you about Ghazali. But there's the question that we talk about history, that theorists talk about this problem about the history's epistemological status, its knowledge status. And here I have the point that there are these two approaches. One, and I use Hayden White here, that we identify the causes of historical events and history as we view it as a science, and Ibn Khaldun will be partial to this view. And then there are also events that are narratives and stories of events that historical events are narratives and they are stories of events, and therefore we need to unpack the linguistic codes within or behind these stories. Now, historians of each camp, that is the two camps, and there are many others, do admit that the critical question of interpretation does enter the historian's account at some point in the construction of his or her narrative. But historians disagree over the relation between the empirically founded aspects of their craft and those elements based on interpretation. Every historian uses a variety of strategies to fill in the various gaps in their account. But since history often deals with things that are no longer immediately perceivable, we do have to admit that historians construct their historiography. In other words, historians imagine and conceptualize their object of interest in specific ways before they bring certain procedures to bear on the data and then explain their materials. And so historical discourse thus features a double representation, writes Hayden White, of the objects of interest and the historian's thought about this object. So for instance, I talked about Ghazali, or I talked about my great-grandfather. First of all, I need to, figure out why I chose my great-grandfather or why I chose Ghazali. And then furthermore, I need to explain what are the facts that I included or excluded, and there my own role in the making of that history is important. I'm aware of time, and I'm also aware of that there'll be other opportunities that I could talk about these issues. But the question here is that Ibn Khaldun, for instance, becomes a major influence for modern Islamic thought. And Ibn Khaldun gives us some really, really great insights, a man who dies in 1406, because he says things that some of us will be surprised by, because he says, you have to know the rules of politics, you need to know the differences between different people, you need to know their character traits, quite a lot of stuff. And then he says, when you get a report, then you must do all this historical work that many modern historians understand. Then you measure the reports that you receive against this philosophical and rational template that you have. And the critical thing he says that we will appreciate today, he's saying that you need to understand politics. You need to understand the foundations of politics and how things are established and the reason certain things come into being. And then only once you understand this fully, and it's quite remarkable that this man at that time could do that. The reason for this is Ibn Khaldun himself was involved in politics a great deal in his North Africa, the areas of today, Tunis and Morocco. And then afterwards, he spent 20 years. He spent 20 years in Egypt as a judge. He was in and out of judgeship and also taught at the various madrasas there. And Ibn Khaldun, gives us a great deal of insight on a whole variety of issues. And I will not elaborate, but I think, just using these slides to see how well he thought the work needs to be done to understand certain things. One example, and I will try to conclude. Ibn Khaldun talks about a certain Umayyad governor. The Umayyads were the first major dynasty that was established after the four caliphs that followed the Prophet. After that time was over, then the Umayyads established it. And the Umayyads had a governor by the name of Hajjaj bin Yusuf. And so Hajjaj is remembered as coming from the family of teachers. But Ibn Khaldun says, when you hear the word teacher, you should not think about teacher the way you think about teacher in the 21st century. He said teaching, and to be called a teacher in the early Islamic period, in the early tradition, these were not teachings the way we understand teaching as a profession, as a craft, but rather teaching was that you handed down certain things. It was tradition. And the people and the agents of knowledge were persons of influence. That is, they were political leaders. And therefore, he says that knowledge and politics were kind of imbricated. They were connected to each other. And this results in a big issue for us, is that the character of knowledge over time changes. But at the very inception of Islam, the political theology of the early period is ingrained in the knowledge of faith. In other words, politics and the religious knowledge, what we call religious knowledge, are really imbricated there. And it does result in major challenges for those of us in the 21st century, because how do you separate the political from the religious? That has been the adventure that many people spend their time trying to understand. The other thing that Ibn Khaldun says, that when you come to his time in the 14th, early 15th century, he says that now teaching and knowledge of the faith tradition is no longer supervised by people in politics. He says that it's now a separate endeavor, and those people do not really have a great deal of, they're not people of influence. And he says they're kind of poor, and the political leaders look down upon them. Now, we might have some disagreements with Ibn Khaldun on that, as to how he sees that, because I think that already by the late Umayyad period, the Abbasid period, and so on, scholarship became somewhat independent from the political. But nevertheless, we will give Ibn Khaldun the benefit of the doubt, because he's also abbreviating a lot of material. So, this kind of these issues that we talk about, knowledge and knowledge tradition, this is what the Madrasa Discourses project, this is a meeting with all of them. This is the kind of issues that we try to explain to people who study in the madrasas, that you can't just talk about knowledge as a single thing, but you need to understand how knowledge was developed in Islamic thought. Now, most believers of faith, people who faithful followers of Islam, would think that the way Islam is today, it was the way it was from day one. And here comes the big shock, that even Muslims within, in other words, people like Ibn Khaldun, understand that the knowledge tradition has an evolution. It develops over time and becomes very different at the time. And so that is some of the work that we do with the madrasa scholars. Now, many of the madrasa scholars that we train come from a traditional background. And I want to share with you the insights of Abul Kalam Azad. Most of you might have heard of Abul Kalam Azad. He was a major kind of freedom fighter, a compatriot of Mahatma Gandhi, and also a scholar, came from a deep traditional background. And Azad, his father was a major Sufi master, and he was supposed to be the successor of his father's Khanqah, that is his father's spiritual lodge. But at the age 15, he wanted to go learn to play music, and to play, not only listen to music, he also wanted to learn an instrument. This, in his environment, was a no-no, because already music is controversial. And for him to now go and do this transgressive act of going to learn to play an instrument in these kind of seedy areas of Calcutta was a major problem. But Azad then, says that that he is trying to understand, what it is, and I want to read for you what he says. He knew that in such an environment that he grew up in, becoming a musician by playing an instrument was suicidal and reckless. But this transgressive search to play a musical instrument was part of a wider set of questions and doubts that overtook Azad. This episode of self-questioning is not uncommon to people who study at the madrasa, the yeshiva, or seminaries, or anywhere else. Azad wrote that at age 15, the certainties provided by tradition began to disintegrate, and the peace of my mind began to tremble, and the thorns of doubt and skepticism pierced the heart. I love this. The peace of my mind began to tremble, and the thorns of doubt and skepticism pierced the heart. He continues, in addition to the voices I heard from all sides, I felt that something else was lacking. I felt the universe of knowledge and reality is not limited to what was in front of me. As I advance in age, these pricks of conscience continued to grow. Now, Azad, survives this period. He becomes a major writer, but he also says something very interesting. He says that, and here you can see in this quote, that the power of tradition and the way tradition holds you, it incarcerates you. He says that it is like being fettered by ornaments, and he also argues that it is stronger than anything else. So in this, I wanted to share this in this slide, the cri de coeur for the spiritual and emotional violence it requires to surrender one life world for another, or to deal with multiple life worlds, as I myself and others also have experienced. What I've learned from my studies and experiences has made me more tentative in pronouncing muscular solutions to complex problems. What I learned from Ghazali was the diversity in his monumental writings produced by his self-reflections. And what I grasp, that is the immense value of the in-between space, the dehliz of daily living and reflection. The spatial metaphor of a threshold or a portal, a dehliz, an intermediate portal separating the Persian home from his exterior, is also a productive dialogical space. And this is what I got from Ghazali, because Ghazali talks about this dehliz, and he was also caught between multiple cultural forces and spiritual and intellectual tensions. And Ghazali imagined and theorized the dialogical movement between the inner and the outer, the esoteric and the exoteric, body and spirit in a productive fashion. He did not configure the dialogic in a simplistic binary relation, but imagined these to be the multiple nodes in a force field. Suspended within this force field was the subject diligently tending to the needs of both matter and spirit. Underlying all our critical activity is the complex hybridity and fuzziness, despite our every pretension to smooth it out. And while over the longer duration, we can sometimes observe dramatic shifts in knowledge, on most occasions we pass through transitions, creases and folds in knowledge and time. The perpetual quest is to seek emergent knowledge arising out of our struggles and transitions for alternative futures. We know one thing taught by experience, that the dominant paradigms need to be continuously contested with alternative ways of knowing, different types of knowledge and models for society building. The future, as Boaventura de Sousa Santos pointed out, has become a personal question for us, a question of life and death. Or as Amitav Ghosh tells in his nonfiction work, The Nutmeg's Curse, and I strongly encourage you to read it, we have to revise our understanding of matter, the vitality of natural and celestial objects. We need to revise our view of that. And we need to address, as he put it, the hold of the economy on the modern imagination has progressed to the point that capitalism has come to be seen as the prime mover of modern history, while geopolitics and empire are regarded as its secondary effects. In order to pursue an improved futures, we also need the past. We require the insights of history not as ready-made solutions, but as creative problems to be addressed, susceptible to opening up new possibilities. Certainly, we need history, Nietzsche wrote, but our need for history is quite different from that of a spoiled idler in the garden of knowledge, he continued, adding, we require history for life and action, not for the smug avoiding of life and action, or even to whitewash a selfish life and cowardly bad acts. Many of the thinkers I discussed were in one way or another compelled to reread the past as an immutable act of God, empowering us to hope and act for an open future. Unfortunately, too many thinkers have understood the progress of civilization in stoutly economistic terms, linking the division of labor to the development of society. It may well be part of the truth, but certainly not the whole of the truth. For it is the life of practice, as secular moralists would describe it, or the prophetic activity, as religious actors would articulate it, that allows us to dedicate ourselves to a life that we seek in its intensities. A life premised on balance and distribution avoids the nihilistic end that beckons without both, namely without balance and distribution. The progress we make in giving shape to the prophetic spirit, a life of practice and will to power, opens the possibilities of new histories, not their inevitability, and least not the end of history. For those who view history as a continuous struggle, a gift carrying the possibilities of progress, the cultivation of civilization remains inviting and utterly tempting. In the end, what do I say about history? I will leave you with this nugget of insight. The last word in this lecture will come from the writings of the literateur, a proponent of mysticism and philosopher, Abu Hayyan al-Tawhidi, who died in 1023, who has been unjustifiably maligned by some religious scholars in the past. Tawhidi was the protege, meaning he was, if not the Boswell, he was the scribe of a man by the name of Abu Sulaiman al-Mantiqi al-Sijistani, his mentor. In this quote of his, he captures the messiness of the human condition, and especially our earnest efforts to understand complex realities and mysteries. The citation comes from Tawhidi's meditations on coincidences and oddities. Coincidences and oddities. But the terms coincidence, ittifaq, and the unexpected, falatat, do not do justice to the meditation. I think what was intended is that things like history and progress are complex, imbricated, meshed, and messy, yet also distinguishable. Tawhidi attributes this fulsome nugget of wisdom to his teacher, Abu Sulaiman. And this is the quote: things are distributed according to the limitations of nature, psychical powers, intellectually indivisible elements, and divine wonder. What exists here on earth is therefore necessarily either something familiar that is related to nature, or something rare related to the soul, or something unique that is related to the intellect, or something wonderful that is related to the divine being. The unexpected is among the last mentioned kind that is related to the divine being. I mean, it permeates these various classifications. History is about contingency. The unexpected is perhaps the most fertile ground of history and the possibilities of progress. But what Tawhidi's insight does help us think is that the unexpected is enmeshed in our understanding of nature, our psychology, and divine wonder. Nature, the person, the human mind, and the role of the divine cannot be separated in our understanding of history. If we ignore it, we do so at our own peril. But more so, we have an impoverished understanding and appreciation of history and the discontents it brings. I thank you.
Thank you, Professor Moosa, for that tour de force. I will be now opening a full seminar on that lecture, and I invite all of you to stay. Actually, as Ibrahim said, you've gotten a wonderful sample in a condensed form, and I know you need to take a breath, of, as you could tell, a range of very sophisticated thought, bringing together philosophy, history, ethics. That was a wonderful display of why we're so pleased that you are the Mirza family professor. So thank you very much.